So as long as I'm on a roll, let's do the second skater from Bridgewater, the third skater. Her name was Marina. Um, she came out of Can Skate, I believe, in the previous winter, same as Lindsay in the previous video, and did spring lessons and came to me in fall. But there was a significant difference. Marina actually looked like she deserved to be out of Can Skate. She had a really good athletic attitude, athletic. She was very aggressive. She liked speed. She didn't mind falling. She really put a lot of time and effort into things. She was basically an ideal skater, personality, attitude, approach. Um, when I got a hold of her, I don't remember having to correct or teach her Wallstrom Saukow. Um, at that point, there was no real emphasis on teaching correct toe loops, so I never really bothered to teach it correctly until they got to double toe. That lasted for quite a while. So she had a really funky single toe, which I don't think I ever got around to correcting. I left the club about a year and a half, maybe even sooner after I started teaching her. Might have been actually later that year. Um, and my details are a little fuzzy on exactly where this was. I remember the timetable and the kid skating and what we accomplished. I know I started teaching her. Things went pretty well. I don't really recall her being stuck on anything or having any problems with any technique or um, even things like stroking and lines and spirals seemed to come fairly easily. We worked on tests. I don't remember having any problem. This is again 22 years ago, but no problem with her remembering anything or executing technique or understanding ideology. The place where I really remember her excelling and why she stands out in my head and is notable for this series of videos is we got up to I know there was a little bit of quality I had to do at the beginning, just getting some speed and good landings and understanding edges and preparation edge and takeoff edge and stuff like that. But we got up to Axel fairly easily, and she's the first girl, I'm thinking, she might be the first student I ever had. The first student of mine, certainly, that I got to land an Axel. Now this, again, I said Bridgewater was the first place where I got my own students. So before that, I had had many coaches who had asked me to come in and help their kids land an axle, and I can remember two or three kids previously that I had been called in as an emergency coach to try to get this kid to land an axle, and all three times within very quickly I was able to get them to do an axle. But it's really hard to tell in those situations how much of it was my influence or maybe giving them a different perspective on things or a different way of saying things, and how much of it was all the background base, the data that they'd gotten from the previous coach. Um, I'd never been called in by a previous coach with the understanding that I would just be able to teach an axle better. It was always a coach that had struggled for a while to get a kid to land an axle, and eventually kind of gave up and knew me and were friends and said, hey, can you come in and help me with this? And I did, and boom. Almost always in one lesson I would get them to land an axle, which should have told people something, but apparently didn't. Anyway, Marina was the first one that got to an axle, and I had my two kids in Bridgewater got there at the same time. Not Lindsay. There was another one whose name, I'm going to say Nicole, but her last name completely escapes me. I don't think I've ever remembered it. And they both got to an axle at roughly the same time. I think Marina got there a little bit before. But the difference then was that my process for teaching an axle at that point was very simplistic. I would say, here's an axle, and I would do one. And then they would do one. Then I get them to do one. That was essentially it. I do a few minor things, but I essentially say, this is an axle, go do this, and they'd go and try it, and then I'd work from there and see what they needed to learn to do it better. And Marina landed it, I believe, either in the first lesson, or I think I would have remembered that, so I don't think so. But it was the first week, probably the second lesson, the second day I did axles with her. I showed her a couple axles, and then she did one. I think she had to do 4 or 5 attempts and finally landed one. None of them were that bad. They were all pretty good. Which isn't the fastest I've gotten a kid to land an axle, but I've gotten people since to land it quicker. But it was one of the quickest I've ever had. Probably one of the 5 quickest. And considering my lack of experience, again, this was my first batch of private students ever that I'd gotten out of Can Skate. all the other private students I'd gotten and all the skaters I'd worked with, which is, at this point maybe 50, 60, 70 kids, were either with other coaches, or I was helping other coaches, or I was assisting other coaches, or I inherited from other coaches. This was one of the first kids I pretty much got out of can skate. She didn't have much in the way of previous exposure to coaching. Anyway, that was pretty cool. And then she landed a double sow within about a week or two. She was landing a double sow. The other thing notable about her was this was her first year ever having a chance to compete, and they had to qualify for provincials back then. They had to go to regionals, which I believe there was South Shore regionals, and they had to place in the top three, I believe, in order to get to provincials. And in her event, there would have been like 9 in her event, 7 or 9 or something. There weren't as many age categories as there were now, or maybe there are just way more kids. And she placed, I believe, 1 regionals, and then went to provincials, where there was the 15 best skaters in the province in her event, in her age category, in her category, and she came, I believe, sixth out of 15. And this is after only being in private lessons for like 5 months. I knew from knowing the other kids, I knew some of them had been in private lessons for 2-3 years, and she was beating some of them, and certainly had a match for either of them. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, that was just before. Did she land an axle at that event? I don't remember that. I kind of think she started landing axle right after that, and then a double sow right after that. But I could be a little off on that. Anyway, she was the first skater that I was, totally clueless coaching. I was making things up as I went because I had no idea how to develop a skater from a young level. But it was really interesting that one of the first skaters I had was able to land an axle super quick and a double sow super quick within like weeks of me exposing them to it. Now, as I said, since then I have done that since, mostly in Labrador. I don't think I've done it outside Labrador. That's where most of my coaching experience comes from now with private students. I have had, again, even after Marina, I had maybe 5 or 6 kids who were with other coaches struggling with an axle, and their coaches asked me to come in and help. Or I was just filling in for the other coach. I know in 2 cases it wasn't, they said, "Oh, David, can you come get them to land an axle?" It was, I'm going away to a competition or a test day, or I'm going away on vacation. Can you come in and look after my kid? They're almost landing an axle. Can you see if you can get them to land it? And I did. In every single case, I virtually did. It's very rare. I can only think of 1 or maybe 2 coaches ever where I was asked to come in and help with an axle and failed to do so. And those kids that I failed to get to land an axle never landed an axle with any other coach, and some of them skated for years afterwards. So I don't feel too bad about that. Now, as I mentioned that because, the temptation would be, well, maybe Marina was just super, super talented, and I don't doubt that she was. But still, a bad coach, or a coach that can't develop talent, or a coach that can't encourage development properly, can stop a talented kid from being successful or doing things right or progressing or landing things. And I've witnessed that many, many times. Now, with this kid, maybe I just had to get out of her way and she would have done it herself, but I suspect I did a little more than that, especially since I was able to recreate those results later on. Anyway, so that's the story of Marina. And Marina and I never really had any problems, I don't think. I did end up stopping working for her, and I believe I left the club like a week after I stopped working for her, which I believe was the beginning of the next winter, but may not have been. I don't believe she did summer school, but my timeline around this area is a little messed up. Anyway, that's the first club that I had private students in. It was because of the can skate and the difficulties I have with can skate, it ended up being not a very good experience overall. But the experience I had with these 3 private students was notable, noteworthy, historical, and gave me a really good insight into what I was capable of doing in the future, which I really liked, which was really necessary. I need that kind of data and input in order to progress as a coach. All right, that's it. I don't think I have anything else to say there.